at 8:06. Now, Russia and Ukraine have failed to agree a ceasefire after a second round of peace talks in Istanbul. The Kremlin says it suggested a 2 to 3 day pause in certain areas, but Ukraine accused them of rejecting the initial offer of a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. The delegations did accept a new prisoner exchange for those who are under 25, ill or heavily wounded. Speaking after the talks, Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister appeared to blame Russia for the lack of progress.
We asked them directly if they were ready to react to our proposals that we handed over to them in written form. A while ago, there was no follow-up on the Russian side. As you can understand, we could not react to the Russian proposals because the Russian proposals were only literally given to us during the meeting. Therefore, the Russians themselves suggested that we need to take a serious look at those proposals.
Well, Volodymyr Zelensky has also spoken from Lithuania as he met Baltic and Nordic allies, where he alluded to Ukraine's continued ambition to join NATO.
Geopolitical gains are just as important to Russia as money or territory. If Putin is allowed to decide who joins NATO, where NATO infrastructure can or can't be, then Russia's appetite for war will only grow. Our shared goal is the opposite, to completely end Russia's hunger for aggression.
Volodymyr Zelensky there speaking earlier. Well, Suriya Jayanti was a US diplomat to Ukraine during the first Donald Trump administration and joins us now on the evening edition. Good evening to you, Suriya. Thanks for being with us. Can we take any progress from today? We've got that prisoner exchange, but I wonder on the credence, really, of both Russia and Ukraine getting together in this way.
I think it's pretty clear at this point that Russia is not negotiating in good faith. In fact, I would say Russia isn't actually doing much in good faith and isn't even negotiating. As the Ukrainian officials pointed out, Russia didn't even submit its proposals until immediately before the 1-hour negotiation that was held and wrapped up earlier today. And so I think to call it even negotiation is to be giving Russia a little bit too much credit. Its positions have consistently been those that seem to intentionally undermine the chance of the negotiations producing anything approximating a peace or even a temporary ceasefire. And I think that's what we can expect going forward.
Should Donald Trump intervene? Is he losing the appetite for this as Russia continues to string things along? Maybe Donald Trump doesn't want to come out and publicly say that he's lost faith that Vladimir Putin is after peace. But should he intervene? Should he interject to get things going? Would that make any difference?
Well, as of course many of your viewers know, Trump promised early on in his campaign that on the first day of his presidency, he would solve the Ukraine-Russia problem. We are now many months in, and it's proven rather more intractable than I believe he anticipated. And the reason for that is that neither side has much of an interest in peace at this point, because for Ukraine, agreeing to peace on the terms that Russia would accept would be essentially a complete loss of at least 20% of its territory, and probably simply rolling out the red carpet for a future invasion. Ukraine has learned the hard way over many hundreds of years that appeasing Russia is simply a chance for Russia to then rebuild its assault capacity. So as my Ukrainian friends and colleagues tell me, they would rather die fighting Russia than die under Russian oppression because they have been through that before. So Ukraine, from that perspective, isn't interested in a peace that Russia would accept, although it desperately wants peace and it desperately wants an end to the violence. For Russia's part, it doesn't want peace at all, partly because its goal seems to be essentially genocide and subjugation, and partly because it seems to think that it is still winning. It is holding about 20% of Ukrainian territory. That is up from the amount it was holding following the 2014 revolution of Maidan and the subsequent Russian invasion. So Russia seems to be stalling, partly so that it can continue its land grab and continue its assaults on Ukraine, and also partly so that if it is ever forced into a peace, it is going into that negotiation with a stronger hand by its own assessment.
Yeah, we have had sight of the Russian proposals for peace, and they've not moved on an awful lot at all. We continue with this stalemate. I mean, look, as we've lent into so far, there is one man who does have influence on this, and that is Donald Trump. But I wonder if there is still political capital there for him. Is he still interested in the role of peacemaker? Will he want to concentrate on his own domestic agenda, perhaps in a stronger fashion than on investing more time in this?
I think it would be unwise for any one of us to try to guess at what Trump's immediate and most pressing concerns are. I think he is somebody who speaks a great deal on a broad number of subjects. And so, but taking him at face value, what he has said is that he is anti-war and has been fairly consistently, I think, over the course of his many years in the public spotlight. So I think we can take that as genuine that he would like the war to end, whether that's because he wants to notch a success or because he has a political imperative that he is hoping to hammer out, we don't know. Whether he has the political capital to accomplish it is also unknown. I think certainly if anybody does, it is the United States, and therefore it is Donald Trump. Nonetheless, we saw, for example, in the Israeli situation in Gaza, that Trump said he was going to solve it day one, and yet the genocide continues. And so I think one could easily overstate the power that any one person has on the global stage. That said, if somebody could end it, it would probably be President Trump.
Yeah, look, President Zelensky has again urged for increased sanctions against Russia, particularly from the US, saying it's important to seriously limit Russia's oil trade and Moscow's use of tankers. And that's something that Donald Trump has hinted at in the past. What would he make of that hugely significant and very ambitious drone offensive over the weekend by Ukraine, smuggling lorries over the border and then launching drones, a huge, costly operation, launching drones inside Russian territory, which has caused significant disruption. It was a huge coup by Ukraine to have done that. Would Donald Trump, would he have applauded it, or would he have thought it was in poor taste on the eve of peace talks?
I think everybody roots for an underdog to some extent, and Russia is very much the Goliath in this situation, and Ukraine is the underdog, is the David here. Ukraine managed to take out 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile carriers with that assault yesterday, which is extraordinary. And it is hard to look at that with anything other than admiration, regardless of one's politics on the situation. It was an audacious plan. They pulled it off brilliantly. It is the stuff of action movies, and they accomplished it. And it should show that Ukraine shouldn't be pushed into making huge concessions in a negotiating room. If properly armed and given time and room to function and to conduct its increasingly offensive war of defense against Russia, I think we would see Ukraine gain a fair portion of its territory back. That would, however, require that other global powers stop supporting Russia, whether that's through helping Russia manufacture drones or whether it's the European Union increasing year over year its imports of Russian natural gas in the form of LNG and still crude oil. Russia continues to make billions, and those billions are actually increasing year over year. So with that amount of money and with the kind of military support that it's getting from China and Iran, for example, Russia can play this game longer than Ukraine. But if Ukraine is given the room to breathe, I think what we would see is brilliance in the form of assaults similar to the drone strikes on the various Russian bases yesterday.
Yeah, it could be a hint of things to come. And just finally, we heard Zelensky there mention NATO again. Is it in everyone's interest, sadly or not, if we're to get an end to this war, does he need to stop talking about his ambition to join NATO? Does that need to be something Zelensky should once and for all concede if these talks are to advance in any way? He needs to let that one go effectively.
So Ukraine applied it in 2003 originally to be admitted into NATO, and various European, and not exclusively European, but mostly European countries within NATO did not want to approve Ukraine's candidacy mostly because it didn't want to have to defend Ukraine should Russia ever attack and invade. And that is, of course, exactly what happened. Since then, I think it's become increasingly clear that NATO is a very, very distant goal for Ukraine, much like EU accession should it even ever happen. And so there needs to be a dose of realism there. I would say Ukrainians have it. I don't think any of them who are paying attention think that suddenly the doors to either NATO or the EU are about to open. I do think, nonetheless, they need to keep pressing the point because you should play every advantage. They should absolutely continue to be trying to get into the kind of organizations and international fora that would provide them some protection against a future Russian invasion. Nonetheless, it is also true that one of the, if I was going to be charitable, I would say reasons, but I believe it's much more of an excuse for the full-scale invasion in 2022 by Russia of Ukraine was the expansion of NATO and this idea that NATO was somehow pressing up on Russia's borders. It is true that NATO was created essentially to contain Russia, or rather expanded, certainly, with that very much as the goal. And so it is understandable that from a Russian perspective, NATO is a bit of an existential threat, even though it is a purely defensive organization. It is absolutely not engaged in any kind of Russian containment or offense against Russia. But however true that logic is in the Russian mind, the logic that NATO is expanding, it sounds in imperialism because NATO isn't expanding into Russia. NATO is expanding into countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, and in some cases, of course, part of the Russian Empire before that, and have chosen new tracks and have engaged in the right of self-determination. So to pay homage to the Russian argument that NATO should be off the table because Ukraine is within its sphere of influence and therefore should not be allowed in because if Ukraine is allowed in, it is an aggression against Russia, would be to legitimize what is an essentially illegitimate argument.
Look, Suriya, thank you so much for being with us. A really astute analysis there. Suriya Jayanti, was a US diplomat to Ukraine during the first Donald Trump administration. Thanks so much for being with us.